Police pulled over the wrong bike. Minutes later, a captain arrived with helicopter brigade. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. On a hot summer afternoon in a small suburban town, a police officer pulled over a man riding his bike down the street. The officer, young and full of self-assurance, stepped out of his cruiser with an air of authority. He squinted at the man on the bike, noticing his weathered appearance. An older gentleman with gray hair, wearing a plain t-shirt and jeans, his bicycle looking like it had seen better days. The officer raised an eyebrow, his posture rigid. Sir, you've been riding in a restricted area. Do you have identification? The man on the bike didn't flinch. His eyes, calm and steady, met the officer's gaze without any sign of fear or resistance. He didn't respond at first, his hands resting on the handlebars, as if weighing whether to speak. The officer waited, impatient, tapping his foot on the pavement. I'm talking to you, old man. Do you even know where you are? The officer's tone had a sharp edge, tinged with sarcasm. The man finally spoke, his voice low but firm. I'm just passing through. I'm not causing any harm. The officer, sensing an opportunity to assert his control, raised his voice. That's not enough. You're trespassing. I'm going to need you to step off the bike and provide identification. The man sighed but didn't argue. He reached into his pocket slowly, producing an old ID card, but before he could hand it over, the officer scoffed and waved it away. What's this? A fake ID, the officer said with a smirk. The man said nothing. Instead, he simply watched the officer's movements, his expression unchanging. Meanwhile, a small crowd had begun to gather across the street, murmuring quietly, their attention drawn to the growing tension. The officer's partner, a younger man still new to the force, stood by the cruiser, watching the interaction unfold. With a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty, just as the situation seemed ready to escalate, something unexpected happened. A black SUV with tinted windows appeared, pulling up quickly to the curb. The crowd quieted, sensing a shift. The officer turned, confused, as the vehicle's doors swung open. Out stepped a man in a crisp uniform, his demeanor commanding, his presence undeniable. He was a captain, and his arrival immediately changed the atmosphere. The younger officer looked back at his partner, his eyes wide. Who is this? He asked, but before he could get an answer, the captain walked toward them. His gaze was fixed on the old man, who hadn't moved from his spot, still calm, still composed. The captain didn't acknowledge the officer immediately. Instead, he stepped up to the man on the bike, his face softening in recognition. You don't belong here, do you? The captain asked, his voice now respectful. The officer, still stunned, began to speak, but the captain raised a hand, silencing him. This man, the captain continued, his voice carrying across the street, is someone who has done more for this country than you could ever imagine. The crowd, sensing something monumental, went silent. The officer's confusion deepened as he glanced between the captain and the old man. The captain's next words froze him in place. This is not just any citizen. This man is a hero, and he deserves respect. The officer, now completely taken aback, stepped back slightly as the crowd murmured in disbelief. The captain turned to the gathered onlookers. You're about to witness something extraordinary. I want everyone to pay attention. He then signaled to the SUV, and moments later, the unmistakable sound of helicopter blades could be heard overhead. The crowd looked up in awe as a helicopter swooped down, its engines roaring, kicking up dust from the street. The officer, now standing still, felt a sense of helplessness wash over him. The old man was no longer just a simple biker. He was someone with a story that far surpassed anything the officer could comprehend. The captain gestured toward the helicopter. Get in, he said to the old man. The man, who had been silent throughout the exchange, nodded slowly. Without a word, he mounted his bike and followed the captain to the waiting helicopter, the blades spinning faster with each passing second. As the helicopter rose into the air, the officer stood motionless, his mouth agape, as the crowd watched in stunned silence. What had started as a routine traffic stop had turned into something far more significant. An event that would be remembered for years to come. One where a humble man on a bike proved that respect and honor can never be measured by appearance alone. I apologize for the confusion earlier. Here is the continuation for part 2, written as per your instructions. The helicopter blades roared louder as the old man, still on his bike, followed the captain toward the waiting aircraft. The crowd remained frozen, their eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before them. The officer, still in a daze, watched as the old man effortlessly mounted the steps into the helicopter, followed by the captain. He had been on the force for years, but nothing in his training had prepared him for this moment. His fingers twitched as if wanting to reach for his radio, but he hesitated. Who was this man? And why did this captain, this military officer, seem to know him so well? The helicopter lifted off the ground with a deep thrum, and in the blink of an eye, it was soaring high above the streets. The officer stood, his hands still outstretched, staring at the fading helicopter in disbelief. His mind raced, trying to comprehend what he had just witnessed. The crowd, once murmuring with confusion, now whispered in awe as the helicopter disappeared into the sky, the roar of the blades fading into the distance. Back at the base, the captain, who had led the helicopter to the scene, paced back and forth in his office. He was a man who had seen it all, who had served in countless operations and missions, but today was different. He had just brought an old man, an unsung hero, into the light, and the weight of that realization sat heavily on his shoulders. The old man, whose name had not been spoken aloud until now, was someone the captain had known for decades. His name was John Miller, and in his time, he had been known as the Ghost of the Jungle, a nickname earned in the deadliest corners of Vietnam, where he had saved countless lives against all odds. The captain's mind drifted back to that time, to the stories he had heard about John. They were just whispers at first, stories of a mysterious figure who appeared out of nowhere to rescue soldiers trapped behind enemy lines. But as the years passed, those whispers had turned into legends, and John Miller's name had become synonymous with miracles on the battlefield. Now, in the present day, those stories seemed impossible, yet the man in the helicopter was living proof. The captain leaned against his desk, his eyes scanning the reports on his screen. The words seemed to blur together as he thought about the mission John had once led, one that had saved an entire battalion. The mission had been classified for years, but now, it was clear that it had been John Miller who had orchestrated the entire operation. He had never sought the glory, never asked for recognition. He had always worked alone, using nothing more than his wits and the trust of his brothers in arms. As the captain sat there, lost in thought, a knock at the door broke his reverie. He straightened up, turning toward the door just as a young lieutenant entered, a look of concern on his face. When he reached the hangar, the scene before him took him by surprise. There, standing in the middle of the massive space, was John Miller, not a man who looked like a legend, but just an ordinary man. His hands were rough and calloused, his clothes worn and simple. He was standing by an old military jeep, his eyes scanning the horizon as if he had never left the field. The captain approached him slowly, not wanting to disturb the quiet moment. But as he got closer, John turned and smiled. A small, knowing smile, one that seemed to say everything without a word. As the two men stood there, side by side, a sense of peace settled over the hangar. The world outside had changed, but in this moment, it felt as though time had stopped, honoring the silent hero who had given everything for his country. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, the captain knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter, one that would finally bring the recognition John Miller deserved, not just as a soldier, but as a legend. I apologize for the confusion earlier. Here is the continuation for part 3, written as per your instructions. John Miller stood quietly in the hangar, his hands folded in front of him, as the captain paced nearby. The hum of the military equipment surrounding them was a stark contrast to the silence that enveloped the two men. The captain, still trying to process everything, looked over at John, his mind racing with the weight of the past few hours. It was almost surreal. A man who had been written off by the world, a figure thought to be lost to history, had just walked back into their lives, not as an old veteran, but as a legend. You know, John, the captain began, breaking the silence. I can't believe you're really here. After all these years, it feels like we've been waiting for someone who was never coming back. John's gaze stayed fixed ahead, as if he were lost in his own thoughts. I never went anywhere, he replied quietly. Just waiting for the right time. The captain shook his head, amazed. What right time, he asked. For the world to remember what you did. For everyone to know the truth. John turned to face him then, his eyes piercing. The truth is, I never did it for recognition, he said, his voice calm but firm. I did it for the men I fought alongside. The ones who never came back. The captain nodded, understanding the weight of those words. But they need to know. Your story, it's not just for you anymore. There was a long pause before John spoke again. I didn't ask for a medal. I didn't ask for a thank you. But I'll tell you this, what we did, what I did, isn't something anyone should forget. The captain watched as John's face softened slightly, as if the weight of those memories was never far from the surface. He could feel the history in the room, thick and heavy. I never wanted fame, but I sure as hell want people to understand why we did what we did. John's words hung in the air, and the captain felt the gravity of them settle deep into his chest. The old man wasn't just speaking about his own legacy. He was speaking for everyone who had served alongside him, everyone who had sacrificed everything without asking for anything in return. The captain walked closer, his mind made up. We need to tell your story, John. People need to know what you did, what you've done for this country, and what you've given up. John stood still for a moment, taking in the words. Maybe one day, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Maybe one day they'll understand. The captain stepped forward, placing a hand on John's shoulder. It's not just about understanding, John. It's about honoring what you've done. John nodded slowly. I'm not here for the glory, he said, his voice quieter now, but still carrying the strength of someone who had seen things others couldn't even imagine. But I don't want anyone to forget the ones who didn't make it out. They're the ones who matter. The captain looked at John, his expression firm, yet filled with respect. Then we'll honor them. We'll honor you. It's time for the world to know the truth. As the two men stood in the hangar, the sound of approaching helicopters could be heard in the distance. The captain turned his head, his mind already ahead. The time had come to make sure the world knew John Miller's story. The world would hear the name of a man who had once been forgotten, but was now being brought back into the light. A legend who had saved countless lives and fought without ever expecting anything in return. And as the helicopters grew louder, the captain felt a sense of purpose fill him. This was just the beginning of the story. John Miller's legacy would finally be recognized, and he would no longer be a ghost in the shadows of history. The world would know the name of the man who had saved his comrades, who had never given up, and who would now take his rightful place in history. The captain straightened his back, the weight of the mission settling in. This was the moment. The world would know, and it was time for the truth to come out. I apologize for the confusion earlier. Here is the continuation for Part 4, written as per your instructions. The hangar doors slowly rolled open, and a line of soldiers marched in, their boots clicking in unison on the concrete floor. The captain stood tall, watching them approach. At the front of the line was General Thompson, his face set with determination, his steps firm and unwavering. The room seemed to grow quieter with each passing second, as if the air itself recognized the weight of his presence. The soldiers came to a halt, their eyes focused forward, a silent respect in the way they stood. General Thompson, a towering figure in his military uniform, nodded at the captain. Is he here? The captain gave a sharp nod. He's waiting for you, sir. Without another word, the general strode forward, his eyes scanning the space until they landed on John Miller, who stood near the hangar's far corner. The general's face softened, a flicker of recognition passing through his expression. John Miller, now a man of age but still carrying the weight of his past, turned slowly, his eyes locking with the general's. For a brief moment, there was no sound, no movement, only the shared understanding between them. The general's hand shot up in a perfect salute, his body ramrod straight. Sergeant Major Miller, he said, his voice thick with emotion. It's an honor, sir. The words hit John like a shockwave. The years of fighting, of surviving, of being overlooked, all came rushing back in that single moment. He stood still for a moment, unsure how to respond. Finally, his own hand raised slowly, returning the salute. The honor's mine, General, he said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of a lifetime's worth of memories. The general lowered his hand, but the respect in his eyes never wavered. "I'm sorry it took so long," he said quietly. "We should have recognized you long ago." John smiled faintly, though there was a sadness in his eyes. "Recognition isn't what matters, General," he said. "What matters is the ones who never made it back." The general's expression hardened with resolve. "They'll be remembered. And so will you, Sergeant Major. Your story will be told." The captain, standing nearby, nodded in agreement. "It's time the world knew what you did, John," he said. John turned to face him, a small chuckle escaping his lips. "You really think people are ready for the truth?" The captain smiled, but there was no doubt in his voice. "They'll have to be. Your actions speak louder than any words ever could." The general turned to the waiting soldiers, signaling them to move forward. "Prepare the briefing room. It's time to make sure everyone knows who this man is." As the soldiers filed out, the general and the captain walked over to John. Together, they made their way toward the back of the hangar, where a large table had been set up for the presentation. The walls of the room were lined with maps and charts, but the focus of everyone in the room was on the man who had just entered. John Miller, the man who had saved so many, whose name had been lost to history, was about to be introduced to the world once more. The general stepped forward, his voice commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we are here today to honor a man whose name has been absent from the history books, but whose actions have saved countless lives. This is Sergeant Major John Miller, and his story is one of courage, selflessness, and unwavering loyalty to his brothers in arms." The room fell silent. Every eye trained on John as the general continued. "In Vietnam, Sergeant Major Miller was known as the ghost of the jungle, a man who went into enemy territory, often alone, to rescue those who were left behind. He never sought fame. He never asked for recognition. But today we changed that." John stood motionless, his heart heavy as he listened to the words that had never been spoken about him. "This man," the general said, "was a part of some of the most dangerous and classified missions in military history. He saved soldiers in ways that no one else could. His efforts were instrumental in ensuring that many of our best men came home." The captain stepped forward then, his voice adding to the general's. "I was one of those men," he said, his gaze locked on John. "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for him." The room was filled with murmurs of agreement, but the general held up a hand to quiet them. "We are here today not just to honor a soldier. We are here to honor a legend, a man whose name deserves to be spoken with the greatest respect, a man who never asked for anything in return for his service, but who has given everything to his country." John looked around the room, taking in the faces of the soldiers who were now standing in attention, their respect evident. For the first time in years, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't about the medals or the recognition. It was about the men who had never come back. And now, their story would be told. The general turned to John, his expression softening. "Thank you, John," he said simply. "Thank you for everything." John nodded, his eyes glistening for just a moment. "It was my honor, sir," he replied quietly. And as the room erupted in applause, John Miller finally felt that the world had begun to understand the true cost of sacrifice. "I apologize for the confusion earlier. Here is the continuation for Part 5, written as per your instructions." The room was silent, save for the sound of soft applause that slowly faded away. John Miller stood at the front of the room, his back straight and his hands clasped in front of him. He had never been one for fanfare, never sought recognition. But today, as the faces of men and women who had served under him stared at him with a newfound respect, it was clear that something had changed. The general's words still echoed in his ears, but it wasn't the applause or the accolades that mattered to him. It was the recognition, not for him, but for the men he had fought alongside, the ones who had never made it home. As the room quieted, the general stepped forward, his eyes locked on John. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice steady and full of resolve. "We're going to make sure the world knows what you did. The world deserves to hear your story, the story of every soldier who ever served with you." John nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the floor. He had spent decades in the shadows, watching as his comrades were forgotten by time. Today, though, that was about to change. The general continued, "We have a plan. We're going to start by getting your story out there, through the media, through books, through the veterans' organizations. It's time for you to take your rightful place in history. John's chest tightened at the thought. He had never wanted to be remembered. But now, as he looked around the room at the soldiers, some of them young enough to be his grandchildren, he knew that it wasn't just his story that needed to be told. It was the story of every man and woman who had served, every life lost, every sacrifice made. The captain, standing by the door, stepped forward and addressed the group. We're going to start by speaking at the Veterans Symposium next month. We'll get the media involved, and we'll make sure John's story is broadcasted far and wide. The general nodded, his expression unwavering. Yes, but it doesn't stop there. We'll ensure that his name is never forgotten. It's time the country knows who he is. John's heart skipped a beat. The thought of being in the spotlight, of having his name spoken with reverence, was overwhelming. He had spent his entire life in the background, letting others take the credit for the things he had done. But this wasn't about him anymore. This was about the men he had lost, the men who would never get a chance to tell their own stories. The captain glanced at John, sensing his unease. I know this is a lot to take in, he said, his voice gentle. But you've earned this. It's time for people to hear the truth. John met his eyes, the weight of his words settling deep within him. The truth, John repeated softly. It's not just about me. It's about all the men who fought with me, the ones who didn't come back. The captain nodded. Exactly. And we're going to make sure they're not forgotten, either. As the conversation shifted to the logistics of getting John's story out to the public, the door to the hangar opened again. A young soldier, perhaps no older than 20, stepped in, his uniform crisp and neat. He had the look of someone fresh out of training, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and nervousness. He paused for a moment, scanning the room until his gaze landed on John. Excuse me, sir, he said, his voice shaking slightly, but I just wanted to say thank you. I read about you in history class. I never thought I'd actually meet you. John turned to face him, his expression unreadable. The young soldier stood there, waiting for a response, his face full of admiration. After a long moment, John spoke, his voice low but clear. Thank you for your service, son, he said. And thank you for remembering the ones who came before you. The soldier's eyes shone with gratitude, and for the first time that day, John allowed himself a small smile. The weight of years of silence seemed to lift, if only for a moment. The soldier nodded, unable to hide his excitement. It's an honor, sir, he said before turning and exiting the room. As the door clicked shut, John looked back at the captain and the general. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. He had been forgotten by many, but not by all. His legacy, the legacy of his comrades, would live on. The general stepped forward once again, a glint of determination in his eyes. We'll make sure of it, John, he said firmly. We won't let your story fade into history. The world will know what you did. John took a deep breath, the silence in the room wrapping around him like a blanket. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. His mission had never been about medals or recognition, but maybe, just maybe, this was the time for the world to know. He had fought for his brothers in arms. And now, it was time to let their stories be heard. All right, John said quietly, the decision settling into his bones. Let's get to work. I apologize for the confusion earlier. Here is the continuation for Part 6, written as per your instructions. As the news of John Miller's return spread, it didn't take long for the media to catch wind of the story. The first press conference was set up just days after the meeting in the hangar. John had agreed to speak publicly, though he had made it clear that he wouldn't be sharing every detail of his life. The room was packed with reporters, cameras set up in every corner, eager to capture the moment. The general stood beside John, their presence commanding the room. A few young soldiers flanked them, their faces filled with anticipation. John stood at the podium, his posture relaxed but his mind fully aware of the gravity of the moment. The questions began almost immediately. Sergeant Major Miller, one reporter called out. Can you tell us about the missions you led during the Vietnam War? What drove you to risk everything? John looked up from the podium, his expression unchanged. I didn't lead those missions for glory, he replied slowly. I did it because it needed to be done, and because there were men who couldn't do it themselves. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The reporter pressed on. But you must have known. The risks. Why go alone? Why not wait for backup? John's gaze shifted to the side, and for a moment, he seemed lost in thought. "You don't wait for backup when lives are on the line," he said quietly. "You do what you can when you can." The reporters exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond. This wasn't the type of hero's story they had expected. This wasn't the kind of soundbite they were hoping for. John's words were simple, direct, and devoid of the dramatization they were used to hearing. The general, standing at his side, noticed the shift in tone. He knew John's humility well. Sergeant Major Miller's actions were legendary. The general spoke up, his voice steady. "What you hear today is just the surface. His bravery, his leadership, it's something you can't truly understand unless you were there. The stories he carries are ones of sacrifice, not just for himself, but for his brothers in arms." The reporters leaned in, their pens scribbling furiously. But as the questions continued, it became clear that John wasn't interested in reliving the past. He wasn't interested in the accolades. He only wanted one thing: for the men who never made it out to be remembered. And for that, the world would have to listen. After the press conference, John left the room with the general and the captain. They made their way down the hallway, their footsteps echoing in the silence. "You did well today, John," the general said, his tone approving but reserved. John shrugged, a faint smile on his lips. "It's not about me. It's about the men who didn't come back." The captain, who had been quietly following behind, finally spoke. "We'll keep telling their story, John. One way or another, the world will hear it." John nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. He thought about the missions, the faces of the men he had fought alongside, their voices that had faded over time. He had carried their memories with him for years, but now, as the world began to take notice, he felt the weight of that responsibility like never before. As they reached the exit, a small crowd had gathered outside the building. The news of John's appearance had spread like wildfire, and people from all over had come to see the man they had only heard about in whispers. Some were veterans themselves, others were civilians, but all of them stood in awe of the man who had returned to a world that had long since moved on. John stopped at the door, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. He didn't want this. He never had. But for them, for those who had served and those who had lost, he would endure this moment. He would allow the recognition, even if only for a fleeting moment. The captain stepped up beside him, sensing the tension in the air. "You don't have to do this," the captain said quietly. But John shook his head. "It's not about me," he repeated. "It's about them, the ones who never made it home." And with that, he stepped outside. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers filling the air as John made his way down the steps. The cameras flashed, capturing the moment for history. But for John, it wasn't about the cameras. It wasn't about the applause. It was about the ones who had come before him, the ones who had paid the ultimate price. He had carried their memory for so long. Now, he could finally let the world know. As he walked through the crowd, shaking hands and nodding in appreciation, John felt a strange peace settle over him. This wasn't his moment. It had never been. But in this moment, he could feel the presence of his fallen comrades beside him. They were with him. And finally, their story was being told. I apologize for the confusion earlier. Here is the continuation for Part 7, written as per your instructions. As the days passed, John's story spread even further than anyone had anticipated. The interviews, the media coverage, the articles, it all seemed to snowball into something he had never wanted. But despite the whirlwind of attention, John remained grounded, his focus always on the men he had fought for, the ones who never returned. He spent his days with the veterans, those who had served in wars of the past, hearing their stories, sharing in their grief, and giving them the respect they deserved. It wasn't about the recognition. It was about making sure that those who had sacrificed were not forgotten. Yet, the world outside continued to celebrate him. In the quiet moments, John would hear the murmurs of admiration from the people who had seen the stories on TV or read the articles in the newspapers. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. There was still work to be done. The general had made it clear from the beginning that John's legacy would be remembered, but there was more to be done to honor the lives lost, to give them the voice they never had. It was during one of these quiet moments, as John sat alone in his small office at the base, that the call came. It was the captain. "John." The captain's voice crackled through the phone. "We've got something coming up. There's a memorial event at Arlington next week. It's time for you to speak." John stood up from his chair, his heart beating a little faster. Arlington, the place where so many of his brothers in arms rested. He had never been one for ceremonies, but this one felt different. This one was for them. "I'll be there," he said simply, his voice steady, despite the weight of the moment. The next week, John arrived at Arlington National Cemetery. The place was filled with the quiet reverence of thousands of lives lost, their memories etched into the stone of the headstones that stretched as far as the eye could see. As he walked through the rows, the familiar ache in his chest returned. This was where his brothers lay, their faces no longer visible, their stories fading away. But not for long. As the ceremony began, John stood at the podium, his hands steady as he adjusted the microphone. The crowd before him was a sea of faces, family members, veterans, and civilians who had come to pay their respects. The general stood to his right, the captain to his left. John looked out at the audience, his heart heavy, but determined. He had lived through the horrors of war. He had seen things no one should ever have to see. But he had also witnessed the strength of the human spirit, the bonds formed in the darkest of times. And that, more than anything, was what he wanted to share. "Ladies and gentlemen," John began, his voice carrying across the crowd, "I stand before you today not as a hero, but as a man who was fortunate enough to make it home. I stand before you as someone who was given a second chance, a chance to speak for the men who couldn't." The crowd listened intently, the weight of his words sinking in. "War takes a lot from you," John continued, "but it also gives you something that nothing else in this world can. It gives you a bond with the men and women you serve alongside, a bond that transcends everything else. And those bonds, that camaraderie, that's what made us strong." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd, resting on the faces of the family members, the veterans, the strangers who had come to honor the fallen. "But there's something else," he said, his voice growing softer. "Those of us who came home, we have a responsibility to tell the stories of those who didn't, the ones who didn't make it, the ones who fought and died for the country we love. Their voices need to be heard." The crowd was silent, the only sound the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. John could feel the weight of their gazes on him, their eyes filled with respect, understanding, and grief. He had said the words he needed to say, but he knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. As the ceremony concluded, the families of the fallen approached the podium, their hands extended to John. One by one, he shook their hands, offering them a word of comfort, a gesture of solidarity. But as he looked into their eyes, he saw something that gave him hope. They were no longer strangers. They were brothers and sisters in arms. The bonds formed in war weren't just about the soldiers who fought beside you. They were about the families who stood behind them, waiting for their return. As the sun set behind the cemetery, casting long shadows over the graves, John knew that the work wasn't over. There was still so much to be done. But for the first time in a long while, he felt that sense of peace that had eluded him for so many years. The world may never fully understand what he and his brothers went through. But in this moment, surrounded by the men and women who had lived through it too, he knew they were not forgotten. And that was enough. I apologize for the confusion earlier. Here is the continuation for Part 8, written as per your instructions. Weeks passed, and John Miller's presence continued to impact not just the military community but also the civilian world. The media had shifted their focus from just telling his story to finding ways to integrate his experiences into a broader narrative about the sacrifices made by veterans and their often overlooked role in history. The general, who had been a constant ally in ensuring that John's name was remembered, approached him one morning with an idea. "We've been invited to the Capitol next week," the general said, his voice full of purpose. "They want you to speak at the Veterans Day ceremony. It's a chance to show the nation what true sacrifice looks like." John paused for a moment, letting the weight of the invitation settle in. He hadn't considered being thrust into the limelight like this, and yet, he knew it was part of the path he had to walk now. It was no longer just about his own legacy, but about giving a voice to the countless soldiers who never made it back. "I don't know about all that, General," John said slowly, his gaze shifting to the window. "I've spent my life in the shadows. But if it helps get their stories told, maybe it's time I step out." The general gave a short nod. "That's all I'm asking, John. For those who fought alongside you. For those who gave their lives. It's not about you. It's about them." John exhaled deeply, feeling the familiar ache in his chest at the thought of his fallen comrades. He had buried so many of them in his mind over the years, never allowing himself the luxury of truly mourning. But this was different. This was about honoring their memory in a way that could resonate with the entire country. "All right," John finally said, his voice firm. "I'll do it. But only if we make sure we honor them. All of them." The general smiled, a rare and genuine expression of respect. "That's the plan, John." The Veterans Day ceremony arrived, and John stood before a packed audience at the Capitol, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had never been one to seek attention, never wanted to stand in front of a crowd. But today was different. Today, he wasn't just a soldier. He was the voice of all those who had fought and died without recognition. The general stood beside him, along with several high-ranking officials. As the ceremony began, John was asked to speak. He stepped up to the podium, his hands steady despite the nerves he felt. The room fell silent as he cleared his throat. "I'm not here to tell you about my medals or my time in the field," he began, his voice strong and clear. "I'm here to speak for the men and women who didn't come home. The ones who fought and died and never got the chance to be remembered." The audience listened intently, their attention fully on him. John continued, his voice unwavering. "I've seen the horrors of war. I've felt the weight of loss in ways that most people can't imagine. But what hurts the most is knowing that those who didn't make it back, their stories are lost in the sands of time. We can't let that happen. We owe it to them to make sure their sacrifices are never forgotten." He paused, his gaze scanning the crowd, his eyes locking onto the faces of the veterans in the audience. "You don't fight for glory. You fight because it's the right thing to do. And when you come home, you don't want to be thanked. You just want to be remembered. That's all we ask." That's all they asked. The room was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, the applause began, building until it was a thunderous wave of sound. John stood there, his hands at his sides, feeling the weight of the moment. It wasn't for him. It wasn't for the recognition. It was for them, the ones who had fought and died. The ceremony ended, but the impact of John's words lingered. As he walked off the stage, the general caught up with him, clapping him on the shoulder. "You did good, John," he said, his voice full of admiration. John nodded, his face a mask of quiet gratitude. "I did it for them," he said softly. "For the ones who never made it home." The general looked at him, his eyes filled with understanding. "And that's why you'll never be forgotten." As the day came to an end, and the Capitol building stood tall against the fading light, John Miller knew that his purpose was no longer just to survive. It was to ensure that the stories of those who fought beside him would never be lost. It was a responsibility he had carried for decades. But now, for the first time, he felt that the world was finally listening. The journey wasn't over. But for John, the most important battle had already been won. He had given voice to those who had none. And in doing so, he had ensured that their legacy would live on forever. I apologize for the confusion earlier. Here is the continuation for Part 9, written as per your instructions. The weeks following the Veterans Day ceremony were a blur of interviews, press conferences, and ceremonial events. John Miller had become a household name. His story spread across newspapers, television, and social media. Despite the media frenzy, John remained unaffected, continuing his quiet work with fellow veterans. He spent most of his time at the local VA hospital, sitting with those who had suffered the same wounds, physical and emotional, that he carried. Each visit was an opportunity to listen, to share a moment of understanding that only someone who had been there could offer. One afternoon, as John walked through the hospital's halls, he was greeted by a familiar face, a man he hadn't seen in years. It was Lieutenant Bill Hawkins, one of the young soldiers John had saved during his time in Vietnam. Bill had been a fresh-faced recruit back then, and now he was a man weathered by the years, his face lined with age, but his eyes still holding the same gratitude that had been there when John first pulled him from the battlefield. "Sergeant Major," Bill said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd see you again." John smiled, his expression softening as he extended his hand. "I never expected you to be here, Bill," he replied, shaking the younger man's hand firmly. Bill chuckled, a bittersweet sound. "I wasn't exactly planning on coming back, but I guess fate had other plans." The two men sat together, catching up on the years that had passed. Bill told John about his life after the war, how he had struggled with the transition, the nightmares, the scars that no one could see. John listened intently, understanding every word, every pause. They talked for hours, as if no time had passed at all. But as the conversation drew to a close, Bill's tone shifted. "John," he began, his voice low, "I've been meaning to ask you something. You've been through so much, you've seen so much. And yet, you're still here, still carrying on. How do you do it?" John leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant for a moment. He had been asked this question before, by others, but for some reason, this time it felt different. He took a deep breath before answering. "I carry on for them," he said quietly. "For the men who never made it home. I carry on so that their stories aren't forgotten. So that the world doesn't forget the cost of freedom." Bill nodded, his eyes filled with a mix of admiration and sadness. "I think I understand now," he said softly. "It's not about you, it's about them. The ones who never got the chance to speak." John gave him a small, knowing smile. "Exactly," he said. "It's about them." The next few days were quieter for John. He continued his visits to the hospital, meeting with veterans, listening to their stories, and offering whatever comfort he could. But the weight of his past still lingered, a constant reminder of the price of war. He knew that the world was starting to recognize his efforts, but he didn't feel like he had truly earned their respect. The more people praised him, the more he felt like he was just a symbol, someone who had been placed on a pedestal, removed from the real struggle. It wasn't until a call came in one evening that things began to change again. The voice on the other end of the line was familiar. "John." The general's voice was firm, yet kind. "We need you." John felt a lump form in his throat. He knew what was coming. "There's a special mission. We've got a new wave of recruits. They don't know what they're getting into, and they need to hear it from someone who's been there." The general paused, giving John a moment to absorb the weight of his words. "We want you to speak to them, to show them what it really means to serve, to make sure they understand the cost." John stood up, the room suddenly feeling too small. He had been away from the front lines for years, but this was different. This wasn't about fighting. This was about passing on what he had learned, about the true meaning of sacrifice. "I'll be there," John said, his voice steady. He hung up the phone and walked to the window, his mind filled with memories of his time in the field. The pain, the loss, the sacrifice, it had never left him. But now, as he prepared to speak to a new generation of soldiers, he realized that it was his duty to pass on the lessons he had learned. It wasn't about glory. It was about understanding. The next morning, John stood in front of a room full of young soldiers. They were fresh-faced, eager, and full of optimism, everything he had once been. He took a deep breath before stepping up to the podium, his eyes scanning the room. "I'm not here to tell you about medals or victories," he began, his voice low but commanding. "I'm here to tell you about the cost. The cost of freedom. The cost of war. The things that you will never be able to fully understand until you're in the thick of it. But you will understand. And when that time comes, you will know what it means to serve." He paused, his gaze lingering on each face in the room. "You're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for everyone. The ones who came before you, and the ones who will come after." The room was silent, every soldier hanging on his every word. And in that silence, John felt a sense of peace, knowing that his message, his story, was reaching the very people it was meant for. I apologize for the confusion earlier. Here is the continuation for Part 10, written as per your instructions. John had spent most of his life living with the weight of his past. His memories, his experiences, were all tucked away in the corners of his mind, hidden behind layers of time and distance. But now, after years of silence, they were coming to the surface, and it felt like the whole world was finally listening. The soldiers he spoke to had no idea what he had lived through, no idea of the darkness he carried with him. But they didn't need to. They needed to understand the responsibility they were taking on, the true cost of their service. As the days passed, John's presence continued to inspire those around him, but it was never about him. It was always about the men who had been forgotten, the ones who had never come back. He spent the next few weeks visiting veterans' hospitals, speaking at schools, and continuing his work with the military, sharing his knowledge with anyone who would listen. But despite the public recognition, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. He had done his part. He had shared his story, but the story was far from over. One day, as John sat in his small office at the base, he received another call. This time, it was from an old friend, a fellow veteran who had served with him in Vietnam. "John," the voice on the other end said, "we need you again." The words hit John like a bolt of lightning. He had known this moment would come, but he wasn't ready. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with concern. "There's a situation," the friend replied. "We've got a group of soldiers in the field, and they're in trouble. They're surrounded. We need someone with your experience to guide them out." John's heart raced, memories of the battlefield flooding his mind. He hadn't been in the field for years, but the call to action was still there, buried deep inside him. "I'll be there," he said without hesitation. The next morning, John found himself back at the front lines. The familiar sound of helicopters overhead and the distant hum of military vehicles brought a sense of déjà vu. He stood next to the general, his old friend, and the captain as they surveyed the situation. "It's bad," the general said quietly. "They've been pinned down for days. We've got one shot at getting them out." John nodded. He had seen this kind of thing before, but it had never been so close to home. He could feel the weight of the soldiers' lives hanging in the balance. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, his voice calm and clear. The general looked at him, his eyes filled with respect. "We need you to lead them out. We'll provide cover, but they need someone to guide them. Someone who knows how to move in the shadows." John didn't hesitate. He had done this 1,000 times before, but this time, it felt different. This wasn't just about survival. This was about showing the new generation of soldiers how to fight with honor, how to live with integrity, and how to carry the memory of their fallen comrades with them every step of the way. "Let's move," John said, his voice low, but filled with the authority that only experience could bring. The operation was tense, every step taken with caution, every movement deliberate. John moved like a shadow through the dense jungle, his mind sharp, his senses on high alert. The young soldiers followed his lead, learning from every decision, every move. They moved through the night, making their way toward the trapped soldiers, and with each step, John could feel the weight of the years lifting. This was what he had been trained to do. This was what he was meant to do. When they reached the perimeter of the enemy forces, John paused, signaling for the others to hold back. He assessed the situation, his mind calculating every possible outcome. This wasn't a mission for glory. This was a mission to save lives. With a signal, they moved again, silently cutting through the underbrush, using the cover of darkness to their advantage. It felt like old times, but there was something more now. Something that went beyond just the mission. As they reached the trapped soldiers, John could see the fear in their eyes. But there was something else too, a glimmer of hope. They had been waiting for someone to come, waiting for someone who could lead them out. And now, they had that someone. "We're here," John said, his voice steady, but filled with a reassurance that calmed the soldiers' nerves. "Follow me." The soldiers moved quickly, following John's lead as they made their way back through the jungle, dodging enemy patrols and taking cover when necessary. It was slow, methodical, but John knew that every step they took brought them closer to safety. Hours passed, but finally, as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, they emerged from the jungle and into the waiting arms of the extraction team. The operation had been a success, but John knew that the real victory wasn't in the rescue. It was in the lesson learned, the lesson that every soldier had a responsibility to those who came before them, and to those who would come after. As the helicopters lifted off, carrying the soldiers to safety, John looked out at the horizon, his heart filled with pride. This wasn't about him. It had never been. It was about the soldiers he had served with, the soldiers he had saved, and the soldiers who would carry their legacy forward. John Miller had led them through the darkness once again, and in doing so, he had proven that the story of sacrifice and honor was far from over. I apologize for the confusion earlier. Here is the continuation for Part 11, written as per your instructions. The mission was complete, but the weight of what John had just done hung heavily in the air. The soldiers they had rescued had been taken to safety, their lives spared, but John wasn't thinking about the victory. He wasn't thinking about the praise or the recognition that had followed him for weeks. What mattered now was the quiet. The moment after the storm had passed, when all the noise died down, and all that was left were the memories. As the helicopter carried them back to base, John stared out of the window, the dark silhouette of the jungle fading beneath them. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a warm glow across the landscape, but the brightness did little to lift the heaviness that weighed on his heart. It wasn't just the mission he was carrying. It was the years of sacrifice, the faces of the fallen, and the knowledge that no matter how many lives he saved, There would always be more battles to fight. The general, sitting next to him, glanced at him, sensing his internal struggle. "You did good, John," he said, his voice calm but filled with a deep respect. John nodded without looking at him, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "It's not about doing good," John muttered quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of experience. "It's about making sure they're remembered. The ones who didn't make it out. The ones who didn't get a second chance." The general fell silent for a moment, the truth of John's words settling in. It wasn't just about the soldiers who had survived. It was about the ones who hadn't, the ones whose stories had faded into the background of history. "We'll keep their memory alive," the general finally said, his voice unwavering. "That's what we're doing here. We're making sure they're not forgotten." John turned his gaze toward him then, his eyes sharp and focused. "And that's why I keep fighting," he said quietly. "For them. For the ones who never got the chance to speak. For the ones who gave everything." The general nodded solemnly. They sat in silence for the rest of the flight, each man lost in his own thoughts. When they arrived at the base, John stepped off the helicopter and onto familiar ground. The quiet hum of the base was different now, somehow more peaceful, more grounded. The soldiers who had been rescued were being treated by medical staff, and the rest of the unit was going over the details of the mission. But John wasn't focused on any of that. He wasn't thinking about the medals, the accolades, or the recognition. He was thinking about the men he had lost, the ones whose names were never spoken aloud, the ones whose stories remained untold. Later that day, as the sun set over the base, John sat outside, looking out at the empty field. The cool breeze carried with it the scent of earth and grass, but it did little to ease the ache in his chest. He had done his duty, had saved lives, but it never seemed like enough. There would always be more. The fight was never truly over. He could feel the weight of the years pressing down on him, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel it. But in the midst of the heaviness, something shifted inside him. He thought about the soldiers he had saved, the soldiers who had looked to him for guidance, for strength. And for the first time, he allowed himself to accept that he had done something good. He had given them a chance to live, to return home to their families. And that, he realized, was what mattered. It wasn't about the recognition, or the ceremonies, or the stories that would be told. It was about the men and women who had served, who had sacrificed, who had given everything without expecting anything in return. That was why he kept fighting, to make sure they were never forgotten. The next morning, as John stood in front of a small crowd at the base, he spoke once more. But this time, there was a calmness in his voice, a quiet certainty that hadn't been there before. "I don't do this for the applause," he began, his words slow but steady. "I don't do this for the recognition. I do this because I owe it to the men who came before me. I owe it to the ones who fought and died and never came back. I owe it to all of you who served, who continue to serve. We don't fight for medals. We fight for each other." The crowd listened, some nodding in agreement, others wiping away tears. John's words were simple, but they carried the weight of a lifetime of experience. And as he finished speaking, he knew that this was what mattered. This was what he had been fighting for all along. I apologize for the confusion earlier. Here is the continuation for Part 12, written as per your instructions. Weeks passed since the ceremony at the base, and John found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. The world had finally recognized his service, his sacrifices, but he still carried the weight of the men he had lost, the ones whose stories had remained untold for so long. The faces of the fallen continued to linger in his thoughts, their names always on the tip of his tongue, but never spoken aloud enough. John's life had always been about the next mission, the next step. But now, with so much attention focused on him, he felt something else creeping in, an overwhelming sense of responsibility. The more people came to him for advice, for stories of courage and survival, the more he realized that he wasn't just telling his own story. He was telling the story of an entire generation of soldiers who had given everything, and too often been forgotten. One evening, as John sat alone in his small apartment, the phone rang. He knew it was the general before he even picked it up. "John," the general said, his voice serious, "I need you for something important. It's not over. We're taking this to the next level." John felt a knot form in his stomach. He had known this day would come, but it didn't make the call any easier. "What is it?" he asked, his voice steady despite the nervousness creeping into his chest. "We've got a special assignment," the general replied. There's a small group of veterans, men who served with you, men you knew well. They've been trying to get their story out for years. We need you to help. We need to ensure they're not forgotten. John closed his eyes, letting the words settle in. He had always avoided the spotlight, always tried to stay in the background, but now it felt like there was no choice. This wasn't just about his story anymore. It was about every soldier who had served in the shadows, whose efforts had never been properly acknowledged. I'm in, John said, his voice low. I'll do whatever it takes. The general's voice softened. I knew I could count on you, John. We're going to make sure their voices are heard, finally. The next day, John met with the group of veterans. They were older now, their faces weathered by time and experience, but their eyes still held the fire of the men they once were. As they sat in the small conference room, the room filled with quiet conversation, each man looking at John, waiting for him to speak. He had been their leader in the field, their guide through some of the toughest times they had faced. But now, they weren't soldiers anymore. They were simply men who had lived through it all, together. John stood at the front of the room, looking at the faces of the men who had once been his brothers in arms. I know why you're all here, he said, his voice steady. You've fought for recognition, for the chance to tell your story. Well, now's the time. We're going to make sure the world hears your voice. This isn't just about us. It's about the ones who never came back. The men nodded in unison, their faces hard but determined. We've waited too long, one of the veterans said, his voice thick with emotion. The world needs to know what we did, what we gave up. John's eyes swept across the room, meeting each man's gaze. And we're going to make sure they know, he said. We'll take it one step at a time, but we'll do it together. We'll make sure the stories that were never told are heard by everyone. The meeting continued late into the night, plans being made, stories being shared. As the hours passed, John felt a weight lifting off his shoulders. This wasn't just about his own redemption. It was about something bigger, something that would ensure the sacrifice of his brothers was never forgotten. The next day, John and the veterans began the long process of telling their stories. They recorded interviews, they wrote down their experiences, and they spoke in front of cameras. Every word, every sentence was another step in making sure the truth came out. As they worked, John found himself reflecting on his own journey. The recognition, the media attention, it had all been overwhelming. But in that moment, he realized that he wasn't just telling his own story. He was telling the story of the men who had stood by his side in the darkest moments. They were finally being given the voice they had been denied for so long. The day finally came when their story was shared with the world. It was broadcasted on national television, featured in documentaries, and printed in newspapers. The faces of the men who had fought beside John, their stories of courage and sacrifice, were finally acknowledged. As the documentary aired on TV, John sat alone in his living room, watching the images on the screen. The men he had fought alongside were now being remembered. The applause, the recognition, it didn't matter. What mattered was that their names were spoken aloud. The world now knew their story. And that, John realized, was what he had been fighting for all along. I apologize for the confusion earlier. Here is the continuation for Part 13, written as per your instructions. The documentary aired nationwide, a culmination of months of interviews, recording, and storytelling. The faces of the men who had served alongside John Miller, their voices echoing through the screen, finally received the recognition they had long been denied. John watched from his small apartment, the faint glow of the television illuminating the room. The images on the screen were powerful, raw and real, a stark reminder of the sacrifices made by so many. As the credits rolled, John felt a sense of peace, but also an ache in his chest. He had done what he set out to do. He had given these men their voices back, ensured that their stories would be remembered. But as the final credits faded, the silence in his apartment felt louder than ever. The recognition, the applause, all of it had come. But it still wasn't enough. John knew it would never be. The world would continue to move on, the stories of sacrifice slowly fading as time passed. The faces of the men he had served with would eventually become distant memories, their stories not so much forgotten, but lost to the rush of the present. But, in his heart, he knew that he had done something important, something that would endure. The veterans who had been silenced for so long now had their place in history. They had their names spoken aloud. They would never be forgotten, not by John, not by anyone who watched that film. The next morning, John found himself standing at the edge of the cemetery, looking out over the rows of headstones. He had visited countless times before, but today, something felt different. Today, the wind seemed to carry the weight of all the years that had passed, all the lives that had been lived and lost. The faces of his comrades, those who never came back, seemed to whisper in the breeze, urging him to keep going. He had done his part, but the work was never over. He would continue to visit them, continue to honor their memories in his quiet way. As he stood there, a small group of veterans walked by, nodding in his direction. They had watched the documentary, had seen their friends and brothers finally get the recognition they deserved. And in that moment, John realized that the fight had never been about recognition. It had been about giving them something much more important. The acknowledgement of their humanity, the acknowledgement of the price they had paid. That was what mattered. It wasn't the awards, the public applause, or the ceremonies. It was knowing that the stories were told, that the ones who gave everything had not been forgotten. Later that afternoon, John met with the general and the captain, both of whom had been with him through this entire journey. The three of them sat in a quiet corner of the base, the weight of their mission still lingering in the air. "You did it, John," the general said, his voice soft with admiration. John looked at him, a faint smile crossing his face. "We did it," he replied. "It wasn't just me. It was everyone who served, everyone who fought and died. We all did it." The captain, who had been quietly listening, nodded in agreement. "It's more than we could have hoped for," he said. "The world knows now. The veterans know now. You gave them their voice." John looked out the window, his thoughts drifting back to the men he had fought beside. "It's not enough," he said quietly. "It'll never be enough. But at least they know now. At least they're remembered." The general placed a hand on John's shoulder. "You've done more than anyone could ask for. You've given them a legacy, and you've given us a legacy." John didn't reply, but he didn't need to. He understood. The journey had been long, and the sacrifices had been great. But in the end, the most important thing wasn't the fame or the recognition. It was the story, the truth. The world would know it now. And that was enough. As the sun began to set over the base, casting long shadows across the ground, John stood up, his posture straight, his heart heavy but at peace. The work was done, but the memories of his brothers in arms, those who never made it home, would never fade. They would live on, in stories, in hearts, in the quiet moments when the world paused long enough to remember. And for John, that was the most important mission of all. I apologize for the confusion earlier. Here is the SEO-optimized description written in one continuous paragraph as requested. In this emotional story, we follow the journey of a war hero, John Miller, who after years of living in the shadows, finally shares his incredible story with the world. Through emotional challenges and moments of reflection, John not only relives his past, but also gives a voice to his fallen comrades, ensuring their sacrifices are never forgotten. This emotional story dives deep into the lives of veterans, the price of freedom, and the importance of remembering those who gave everything. As John's journey unfolds, his story becomes a beacon of courage, highlighting the emotional power of sacrifice and the true cost of war. This emotional story brings the memories of fallen soldiers to life, giving them the honor they've always deserved. Watch as the layers of John's past are peeled back in this deeply moving emotional story, leaving a lasting impact on those who hear it.